Good afternoon. My name is Alicia, and I would like to welcome you to OSC's Public Contracting Oversight Division Introduction Webinar for new officers, employees, and appointees of New Jersey state departments, offices, divisions, independent authorities, boards, and commissions. Our agenda for today's webinar is as follows. We will begin by introducing you to the Office of the State Comptroller. We will then explain what the Public Contracting Oversight Division of OSC does as it relates to the governmental units you are right now representing. Then we will spend some time explaining PCO's procurement review processes, including an explanation of what constitutes a contract and a procurement, and what specific things we are looking for when we do a review. We will then briefly discuss some high-level compliance matters that will be very useful to you as you begin in your new positions. And finally, we will take questions. Please note this presentation will be made available to all of those who registered for this session at the conclusion of the webinar with active links available for all the links you will see throughout the presentation. We hope this will assist you not only in gaining high-level understanding of procurement and contracting in New Jersey, but also provide you with a practical guidance document that you can use going forward in your work. So let's talk about OSC a little bit first. OSC was established by law in 2007, and it was created as an office in 2008. The mission and the statutory obligations of OSC are to monitor, investigate, and review all units of New Jersey's government, which means all state and local governmental units in New Jersey, constituting around 1,900 separate entities, and including independent state authorities and commissions, state agencies and offices, local units and all of their authorities, utilities, and commissions, counties and all of their authorities, utilities, and commissions, school districts and school boards, whether operating or not, and all units of public education, including units of higher education. OSC has the statutory authority to provide guidance, technical assistance, performance reviews, procurement reviews, and training regarding best practices, legal compliance, and procedures to eliminate and reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. OSC has 4 divisions: Medicaid fraud, which is the successor to what was once known as New Jersey's Medicaid's Inspector General, as well as the Audit Division, the Investigation Division, and the Public Contracting Oversight Division. So let's talk a little bit about what the Public Contracting Oversight Division does. Today, we're going to specifically introduce you to our Public Contracting Oversight Division, which was formerly known as the Procurement Division. PCO monitors, reviews, and provides training, guidance, and technical assistance relating to public contracts for all of New Jersey's governmental units. PCO's duties include ensuring compliance with all applicable laws relating to the procurements and the contracts it reviews. New Jersey laws were enacted to ensure competition, transparency, and public confidence in government spending. Compliance with these laws is imperative to demonstrate the level of competition, transparency, fairness, and equality in public spending in New Jersey that is required to maintain public confidence in our government. PCO has the authority to investigate procurement and contract-related matters and to issue public and private letters and reports based upon our findings stemming from these monitoring investigations and reviews. But any public issuance is subject to specific regulatory notice requirements. Generally, absent a public issuance, documents reviewed by PCO are subject to statutory confidentiality requirements and are subject to the advisory, consultative, and deliberative process exception from OPRA. It is important for you to know who you are working with here at our office and who your teams will be working with when they have procurement and contract reviews with us. My name is Alicia Walsh. I am the director. I have been with OSC for 10 years. Jeffrey LeGrand is the acting deputy. He's been with OSC for almost 5 years. And Ashley is our acting supervising attorney, and she's been with OSC for around 3 years. We also have 9 staff and senior staff attorneys, 1 paralegal, 1 administrator, and collectively our division has over half a century of experience in government and over a quarter-century experience in procurement law. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ashley for a more in-depth understanding of specifically what your interactions with OSC's Public Contracting Oversight Division will look like.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Alicia indicated earlier, we are first going to discuss the PCO review process, starting with the reason PCO conducts procurement reviews. First, we have Executive Order 166, which was signed by Governor Murphy on July 17, 2020. It directed each principal department, state agency, and state authority to submit procurements which utilize COVID recovery funds valued at $150,000 or more to OSC for pre-advertisement review, which means prior to solicitation or advertisement. As part of Executive Order 166, it requires the posting of contracts to the COVID transparency website. Then we have Executive Order 125, which was signed by Governor Christie on February 8, 2013. It directed each principal department and state agency to submit procurements utilizing Sandy recovery funds to OSC for pre-advertisement review. An important distinction between EO 125 and EO 166 is that EO 125 does not have a dollar threshold amount. EO 125, however, similar to EO 166, also requires posting to the Sandy Transparency website. Finally, we have PCO's statutory authority to conduct procurement reviews. Pre-advertisement reviews are discussed at Section 10B of OSC's statute. Post-award reviews are discussed at Section 10A of OSC statutes, and emergency procurement reviews are discussed at Section 10C. Each statutory review comes with its own notice and submission requirements, which I'm going to discuss further on the next slide. So on this slide, as I indicated, we're discussing the notice and submission requirements. Pursuant to OSC's regulations, contracting units must use the submission forms available on OSC's website and submit the notice as well as the submission documents to OSC electronically. In the next bullet, I included the timeframes for submission to OSC. The timeframes depend on the type of procurement and or the funding source for the contract. As you can see, for contracts utilizing COVID recovery funds pursuant to EO 166, submission should be made to OSC not less than 10 days prior to any advertisement, negotiation, or solicitation. For contracts utilizing Sandy recovery funds pursuant to Executive Order 125, submission should be made to OSC not less than 10 days prior to any advertisement, negotiation, or solicitation. And then for post-award reviews pursuant to Section 10A of OSC's statute, submission should be made to OSC no later than 20 business days after the award. For pre-advertisement reviews pursuant to Section 10B of OSC statute, submission should be made at least 30 days before advertisement or solicitation. And for emergency procurements pursuant to Section 10C of OSC statute, submission should be made to OSC no later than 30 business days after award. So if contracting units are required to use the OSC compliance form, that raises the question of where they can be found, which I discuss on the next slide. I included a screenshot from our website, which provides directions on how to find and how to submit the submission forms. Each type of notice that I discussed on the last slide, contracts pursuant to Executive Order 166, 125, and OSC's statutory review thresholds, they each have a separate submission form that needs to be submitted. I did also include a link on this slide indicating where the submission forms can be found. What's very important is that you must use the current version of the appropriate notice form and follow the directions on our website prior to submission. On this slide, we included a chart that includes the statutory threshold and the notice requirements. And I know I discussed them previously, but I'll go through them real quickly here. First, it's important to note that OSC's statutory threshold amounts were adjusted effective July 1st, 2025. At the top, we have OSC's pre-advertisement review threshold, which we also refer to as a 10B review. It applies to contracts involving consideration or an expenditure of $15.2 million or more. With 10B reviews, procurement should be submitted to OSC at the earliest time practicable, but no later than 30 days prior to advertisement. In the middle, we have post-award reviews, or also known as 10A reviews, for contracts involving a consideration or expenditure of more than $3 million, but less than $15.2 million. For post-award reviews, contracts and all other required documents should be submitted to OSC no later than 20 business days after contract award. And then finally, on the bottom, we have emergency contracts, or 10C reviews. These are for contracts issued pursuant to an emergency involving consideration or an expenditure of more than $3 million. The contract and all other required documents shall be submitted to OSC no later than 30 business days after award of the contract. I also included a chart for the executive orders. Pursuant to Executive Order 166, for any contract funded with COVID recovery funds, any proposed contract valued at $150,000 or more must be submitted to OSC for pre-advertisement review no less than 10 days prior to advertisement, negotiation, or solicitation. On the bottom, we have Executive Order 125, which indicates that any proposed contract that involves EO 125 funding must be submitted to OSC for pre-advertisement review not less than 10 days prior to advertisement, negotiation, or solicitation. And again, I just want to point out for EO 125, there's no dollar review threshold. Now that we discussed the review thresholds, it's important to go over what's considered a contract for OSC review purposes. First, I want to note that the definition of a contract that's provided here on the screen, it's for OSC jurisdictional purposes. It's not the general legal definition of a contract. Pursuant to OSC's regulations, contracts are an agreement supported by consideration and enforceable at law, and any amendments, extensions, modifications, or change orders thereto, or renewals thereof. I also want to point out that Section 3.1 includes in the definition of a contract extensions, amendments, change orders, and renewals. Section 3 of OSC's regulations also include the notice and submission requirements for these types of contracts. I also want to point out that Section 3.1 of OSC's regulations, specifically paragraph G, it further defines what a contract is not for OSC jurisdiction purposes. I'm not going to go over those here, but it's just important to know that that's also found in our regulations as well. Now we're going to discuss how to determine the value of a contract. Again, it's PCO's regulations, that's specifically Section 3.2, that discuss the procedures for this evaluation of a multi-year and multi-award contracts. Valuation is important because it's the value that determines value that determines what threshold is met for OSC review purposes. The main points in valuation are to act in good faith and use professional judgment. The use of professional judgment can be demonstrated by basing a good faith valuation on a prior similar contract or another iteration of the same contract. Speaking of good faith, I also provided a slide with a bit more information on what that entails. First, I will say if there's an independent cost estimate or an ICE for valuation purposes, you should be working off that. Good faith also requires the inclusion of a standard deviation from the independent cost estimate. So if the ICE is old, it should be adjusted for inflation or deflation. Now we're going to go into what PCO reviews. So first, it's important to note the purpose of our reviews. The purpose of our reviews are to ensure competition, transparency, public confidence in government, avoidance of favoritism, and we want to confirm compliance with all laws applicable to the procurement. Section 3.11 of PCO's regulations discuss the contract review process, how PCO offers guidance, and what further action is possible during our review, including whether further fact-finding is required, if referrals are necessary, or if there's a request for a corrective action plan from a contracting unit. And that, again, can all be found in Section 3.11 of PCO's regulations. In the next few slides, we're also going to briefly go over what OSC looks for when conducting a pre-advertisement or a post-award review. So first, we're going to discuss pre-advertisement reviews. As part of this, the first thing that we review when we're reviewing the submission documents, we look to see if the correct procedure is being utilized. In order to determine this, we look at the statutes, regulations, and any other documents or law that are applicable to the type of procurement being reviewed. In state contracting, we commonly look at Treasury circulars, some of which I include here for different types of procurements, including DPAs, waivers, professional services. The procedure being utilized by a contracting unit will change depending on the type of procurement being reviewed. As you can see here next to state authorities, the question is, was EO 37 complied with? If the contracting unit is a state authority, we review Executive Order 37, which applies to them. I'm going to go over EO 37 further a little later in my presentation. And then also, if the review is about a purchase off of a state contract, we also review the method of operation if the state contract had one to make sure that the procedures outlined therein were followed and any necessary approvals were received. We also look if there are any funding source requirements. For instance, pursuant to EO 166, we look to see if 2 CFR Part 200, Appendix 2 was complied with. Was the required language included in the solicitation? When we're also looking at the solicitation, there are a few things that, that we're looking for. We want to make sure that the scope of work is clear, that the language of the solicitation doesn't favor a particular bidder. If there are pre-qualification requirements, are they reasonable and are they authorized under the law? Finally, we also look to make sure that all statutory requirements are satisfied. If there are required forms, were they included? And are they the most recent forms or are they outdated? If there's mandatory statutory language, we review to make sure that the language is the most recent and active language that's currently that's there. So these are just items that we would look for during a pre-advertisement review. This next slide specifically discusses what we look for contract amendments and extensions. So we look to see if the proposed scope of work for the amendment or for the amendment is consistent with the contract. This is important because if the proposed scope of work is outside or too far removed from the scope of work of the original contract, that can be considered a no-bid contract. For extensions, we determine whether the extension was permitted within the terms of the original contract. And for both extensions and amendments, we review to determine the reason. What was the cause? Why is this extension needed? Why is this amendment needed now? This is a slide on EO 37, which I brought up a little earlier. So EO 37 applies to state authorities, which on this slide, I included a definition of state authorities. It includes all independent state authorities, any board, commission, or agency that is organized in but not of a principal department of state government, and all state authorities that are required to submit minutes, resolutions, or actions for governor approval or veto. I also included a link that provides a full list of the state authorities in New Jersey. The goal of EO 37 is to increase transparency and uniformity in procurement processes for state authorities. On the right-hand side, I included reference to specific paragraphs that can be found in the executive order. First and foremost, I'll bring up paragraph 7, which indicates that all procurement contracts are to be awarded by state authorities in accordance with the preset and transparent procedures established by each authority and reviewed by the governor's authorities unit. Paragraph 9 goes over, discusses how contracts for the purchase of materials, products, and supplies shall be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder, absent exceptional circumstances. Paragraph 10 goes over the fair and transparent process that should be utilized for professional service contracts. And paragraph 16 and 17 of EO 37 is important because it discusses the specific circumstances and process that should be utilized if a state authority is invoking an exception to advertising. Now we're going to discuss post-award reviews. These are just a few of the questions that OSC has in mind when reviewing the submission documents. Did the entity follow the proper statutory procedure? Was the contract awarded pursuant to the proper standard? Was it low bid or was it price and other factors? Also, did the resolution or award memoranda or notice of award, did the standard indicated in there match what was in the solicitation documents? Was the contract awarded for the correct duration? Did the bid or proposal comply with the solicitation? Were the required forms properly completed, and were they provided at the correct time, at the statutorily mandated time, depending on the form? If there was a bid protest or litigation, what was contested, and was the protest justified? Throughout the last several slides, I referred to the solicitation documents and the documents submitted to OSC, which brings us to this slide, which lays out what documents are required to be submitted by a contracting unit to OSC. So first here, I just want to point out that I did include a link to PCO's regulations, and I provided on the right-hand side a list of different regulations and what they apply to. It's important to note that different document submissions are required depending on the procurement type and the review threshold. For instance, Section 3.3 of OSC's regulations lists the documents required for post-award reviews, whereas Section 3.5 lists the documents required for emergency procurement reviews. Section 3.8 lists the documents required for state contract purchases, cooperative purchases, sole source provider contracts, professional service contracts, insurance contracts, and competitive bidding. On this slide, I provided a list of common compliance items that OSC examines and reviews when conducting a procurement review, whether on a post-award or pre-advertisement review basis. It's important, I just want to point out that this is not a checklist, but it's just a list of common items we look for when completing a review. All of these items are not applicable to every state procurement. Finally, on this slide, I provided helpful links and citations that may be of help when preparing a procurement for submission to OSC. I included a link to OSC's rules. I also provided a citation to PCO's regulations. I also provided a link for where Treasury circulars can be found. They are helpful when conducting an array of procurements from GPs to waivers to professional services. So at that link provided, you could find Treasury circulars. I also included a link to N.J.S.A. If a state contract is being utilized, you could do a search on N.J.S.A for the specific contract. And if there's a method of operation or any other amendments or extensions to the contract, that can usually be found there as well. Thank you for attending our presentation. On this slide, I've included a link to OSC's website. I included my contact information, as well as the email for submission for contract submissions to OSC. If you have any information about fraud, waste, or abuse of public funds, you could submit a complaint to OSC using any of the methods indicated on this slide. You could go to our website, you could email us, or you could call us. Now, I would say if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Just so everyone's aware, any questions that I do not answer during today's webinar will be responded to individually.